All right, we are going to add one more story today. This is story 7. And I want you to look at that picture. I covered up the name because I want you to see if you recognize this person. This is none other than BB's assistant, Calvin. So we're gonna find out some more about Calvin today. Um, in the last story, we learned that Calvin did not like, or he loved art, but he didn't like to do art. He was BB's assistant in her race to draw as many pictures as she could. This one kind of looks like Calvin's a little defeated. He's not got the greatest expression on his face. It looks like he has a paper crumpled up and he is heading down the stairs. So that means he's probably leaving the classroom because remember the classroom is on the 30th floor. So I wonder where Calvin might be going with his crumpled paper and his sad little face. All right, here we go. Story 7, Calvin. Calvin had a big, round face. Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, I want you to take this note to Miss Zarves for me. Miss Zarves? Asked Calvin. Yes, Miss Zarves. You know where she is, don't you? Yes, said Calvin. She's on the 19th story. That's right, Calvin. Take it to her, please. Calvin didn't move. Well, what are you waiting for? Asked Mrs. Jules. She's on the 19th story, said Calvin. Yes, we've already established that, said Mrs. Jules. The 19th story, repeated Calvin. Yes, Calvin, the 19th story, said Mrs. Jules. Now take it to her before I lose my patience. But, Mrs. Jules, said Calvin. Now, Calvin, unless you would rather go home on the kindergarten bus. Yes, ma'am, said Calvin. Slowly, he walked out the door. Ha ha, laughed Terence. Take it to the 19th story. Give it to Miss Zarves, hooted Myron. Have fun on the 19th story, called Jason. Are you wondering what's so weird about the 19th story? Calvin stood outside the door to the classroom. He didn't know where to go. As you know, when the builder built Wayside School, he accidentally built it sideways. But he also forgot to build the 19th story. He built the 18th and the 20th, but no 19th. He said he was very sorry. Do you think this builder still has a job? There was also no Miss Zarves. Miss Zarves taught the class on the 19th story. Since there was no 19th story, there was no Miss Zarves. And besides that, as if Calvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Mrs. Jules had never given Calvin the note. Boy, this is just great, thought Calvin. I'm supposed to take a note that I don't have to a teacher who doesn't exist and who teaches on a story that was never built. He didn't know what to do. He walked down to the 18th story, then back up to the 20th. Then back down to the 18th, and back up again to the 20th. There was no 19th story. There never was a 19th story, and there never will be a 19th story. Calvin walked down to the administration office. He decided to put the note in Miss Zarves' mailbox. Oh, great idea, right? You would think. But there wasn't one of those either. That didn't bother Calvin too much, however, since he didn't have a note. He looked out the window and saw Louis, the yard teacher, shooting baskets. Louis will know what to do, he thought. So Calvin went outside. Hey, Louis, Calvin called. Oh, hey, Calvin, said Louis. He tossed him the basketball. Calvin dribbled up and took a shot. He missed, and Louis tipped it in. Do you want to play a game? Louis asked. I don't have time. I have to deliver a note to Miss Zarves up on the 19th story. Then what are you doing all the way down here? Louis asked. There is no 19th story, said Calvin. Then where's Miss Zarves? Asked Louis. There is no Miss Zarves, said Calvin. What are you going to do with the note? Asked Louis. There is no note, said Calvin. Oh, I understand, said Louis. That's good, because I sure don't, said Calvin. It's very simple, said Lewis. You're not supposed to take no notes to no teachers. You already haven't done it. Calvin still didn't understand. I'll just have to tell Miss Jules that I couldn't deliver the note, he said. That's good. The truth is always the best, said Lewis. Besides, I don't think I understand what I said either. Calvin walked back up the 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jules' class. Thank you very much, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Calvin said, but Mrs. Jules interrupted him. That was a very important note, and I'm glad I was able to count on you. Yes, but you see, you delivered the note to Miss Zarves on the 19th story, asked Jason. How did you do it? What do you mean, how did he do it? Asked Mrs. Jules. He gave Miss Zarves the note. Some people, Jason, are responsible. But you see, Mrs. Jules, said Calvin. The note was very important, said Mrs. Jules. I told Miss Zarves not to meet me for lunch. Don't worry, she won't, said Calvin. Good, said Mrs. Jules. I have a coffee can full of Tootsie Roll Pops on my desk. You may help yourself to one for being such a good messenger. Thanks, said Calvin. But really, it was nothing. And that is the end of Calvin's story. So when they built the school, they forgot the 19th story. So how could they solve the problem of the missing 19th story? Think about that. Because I'm wondering why they didn't just have a 29 story school and make the 19th and then 18, 19, 20. But, for the sake of the story, we have to have a missing 19th floor with missing Miss Zarves. So, next story we will read about is Myron. So, stay tuned for his story coming soon.